I hope that applause is as enthusiastic at the end of the talk. All right, let me start with basically defining the marginalist revolution. Actually, as Austrians, we're very interested in one of the three co-discoverers of the law of marginal utility, and that's Carl Menger. The marginalist revolution refers to the co-discovery simultaneously of the law of marginal utility by three separate economists that were working independently of one another. The Austrian Carl Menger, the Englishman William Stanley Jevons, and the French-Swiss economist Leon Walras. Now, all three of these men, in their own way, attempted to bring back the consumer into economics. Okay? As we'll see in a few minutes, the classical school, though it had made many important contributions, which Menger himself recognized, had left the consumer out of economics. Now, unfortunately, both Jevons and Walras were mathematical economists, so that they conceived of marginal utility as really a quantity that was subject to mathematical operations. It was really only Menger who conceived of marginal utility as the outcome of an individual actor's judgment about the importance of various things in his environment, okay, things that we will call goods. Menger was born in 1840 to a family that had been ennobled. He was Carl von Menger. He dropped the von in his teenage years, and he died in 1923. The most important fact about Menger is that he really is the sole founder of the Austrian School of Economics. Okay, there was a very rich and long prehistory of the Austrian School, starting in the Middle Ages, featuring very prominently the Spanish Scholastic School, and then also being carried on in Italy, France, and Germany. Okay, there was a subjective value tradition which did attempt to set the wants of consumers as the center of economics. But it was Menger, and Menger alone, who really used the principle of marginal utility to develop a whole theory of economics with human wants at the center. Okay, I might mention the French school in particular, the French liberal school, starting with J.B. Say, or even before him with Turgot, focused very, very closely on human wants. Okay, and in particular, Frederick Bastiat talked about human wants as the starting point of economics. Now, let me just read you a few quotes from prominent historians of thought regarding Menger's position as the originator of the Austrian school. For example, Joseph Schumpeter, who Professor Hoppe mentioned last night, as a very prominent member of the third generation of Austrian economists, wrote that, quote, Menger is nobody's pupil, and what he created stands. Menger's theory of value, price, and distribution is the best we have up to now, and that was in the 1920s. Mises wrote, what is known as the Austrian School of Economics started in 1871 when Carl Menger published a slender volume under the title Grundsätze der Volkswirtschaftslehre, Principles of Economics. Until the end of the 70s, that is the 1870s, there was no Austrian school. There was only Carl Menger. Okay? And Hayek wrote that the Austrian school's fundamental ideas belong fully and wholly to Carl Menger. What is common to the members of the Austrian school, what constitutes their peculiarity, and provided the foundations for their later contributions, is their acceptance of the teaching of Carl Menger. Okay? And this is certainly true. Okay? None of those words were an exaggeration, or none of the words was an exaggeration. Let me just say a few words about the classical school. Okay, that is a state of economics on the eve of, and let's call it the Mengerian Revolution. Okay, because the Austrians really see Menger as their forerunner. Okay, so on the eve of the Mengerian Revolution in 1871, there was a very prominent school of economists who developed a full-blown theory of economic action. It was the British classical school. Its most prominent members were David Hume, philosopher and economist, Adam Smith, of course you've heard of, and David Ricardo. Okay. Basically, that school made two very important contributions. First, they pointed out that prices, the everyday prices that we see in the real world, okay, were not the result of whims or accidents, okay? They were determined by immutable law, okay? Immutable economic law. That was the law of supply and demand. So the classical school really distinguished itself by focusing on the determination of prices as a result of a law. But secondly, what the classical school pointed out was that prices also regulated production. And here's what Mises said, that the classical school really did develop a theory of calculated action. Okay. What he meant by this was that really they put the businessman at the center of economics. Okay. They did that because they really lacked a good theory of value. Okay, but we'll get to that. Basically, what the classical school said was the following. If, for whatever reason, there's an increase in demand, and remember, they did believe in supply and demand. They didn't really explain demand. They didn't explain what was behind demand. Okay, they were more focused on the supply side for reasons that I'll explain. But when demand increases, there's an increase in prices. So, for example, if we have an increase in the price of natural gas as a result of increased demand, profits go up in that industry. Okay, that will then stimulate entrepreneurs, both those who are already in the industry and those who are looking around for a good investment, to jump in and invest in expanding supply, okay, in that industry. As they do that, that will increase supply, and supply then, as it increases with a given demand, will cause prices to fall. Profits will eventually be pushed back down to what the classical school called the normal level, okay, that just repaid the wages. They really, the classical school had another flaw, that is they didn't distinguish between the managerial function, the entrepreneurial function, and the capitalist function. So basically said that prices would be pushed down to a level at which profits were at a normal level. And what they meant by that was that there would be no more expansion of supply in that industry. On the other hand, they said if there were losses, businessmen would see that prices were below their costs. As a result, they would begin to reduce their investment in the industry. And new comers into the industry would be dissuaded from investing in that industry. In that way, the price system regulated the allocation of resources. The classical school fully understood that. Okay. Now, what were the problems with the classical school? Okay. The problem with the classical school was that there was no role for the consumers in this. They did take demand as given. They did say that before you can have an economy, you have to have consumers with a demand. But they didn't explain it. The reason why was because they tended to think in broad, abstract classes. For example, they talked about bread, diamonds, coal, air, and water. Okay, not units of those various goods. For example, they would say something like, well, in fact, let's talk about the paradox of value. They were confronted by the following paradox. It's true that bread is the staff of life. That without bread, people would pretty quickly die of hunger, and they couldn't satisfy any other of their human wants. And that therefore bread, in some abstract sense, was more important than diamonds. Okay? Diamonds were mere frippery. Okay? They were something that people appealed to people's vanity, okay, or to their aesthetics values. Okay? But certainly, without diamonds, the human race wouldn't be that much worse off. Okay? However, now here was the paradox. Why was it that diamonds, despite the fact that they were much less useful or had a lower use value than bread, had a much higher exchange value or market price than bread? That was the paradox of value. And because they thought in terms of abstract classes, they couldn't resolve that paradox. What they did then, they proceeded by saying, well, every good has to have a use value, okay? But we're not going to talk about use value. Economics is here to explain exchange value, okay? So they split values into two categories, use value and exchange value, and they focused on the exchange value to the exclusion of use value. This approach led them to conclude that, first, value is inherent in goods. It's some sort of metaphysical substance. Labor sweating over, let's say, making an axe or let's say, harvesting wheat gives the value to the axe or the wheat. Okay, there's some sort of labor sweat embodied in the good. Okay, Secondly, their approach led them to say that really value is conferred on the goods by the production process. Okay. That is, by the very process of production, by the amount of labor, by the capital and so on that is used. And so they measured value by cost of production. For example, some of them measured it by the number of labor hours in the good. Others used the various costs, including other things besides labor, capital goods and natural resources that were used. Okay. But notice the consumer was not central to their story of how value was determined. It was the number of labor hours, or the money cost of production that determined value. Okay. That is, whether or not, whatever my attitude towards this bottle is, okay, the value is inherent in this bottle of water. Okay. It's been bestowed on it by the labor process. Okay. Okay. So that was one of the flaws. Well, that was a major flaw. And that led them to other problems, one of which was that exchange, whenever two goods were exchanged, they believed that there was an equivalence between the two goods. That is, if I spent $1 on this bottle of water, then that implied that the dollar and the bottle of water were equal in value. Okay? Or if under a system of barter, I traded, let's say, 2 cows for 1 plow, then the 2 cows and the plow were equal in value. Okay? That was another problem. Also, as I said, they did concentrate on the businessman and not the consumer. Okay, they had no way of analytically bringing the consumer in. And they also expanded this approach to explaining the incomes that factors receive. Okay, that is, I won't go into this in much detail, but what's called the theory of distribution of income in society, according to the classical school, their whole theory was aimed at explaining why laborers in general, as a class, got a certain proportion of the total output in society, why landowners as a class got a certain proportion, and why capitalists, entrepreneurs as a class, got a certain proportion. So they were trying to explain the overall shares of profit, of wages, and of rents. Okay, not the individual values of individual types of labor, individual capital goods, and so on. Okay, they did not address that problem. Right. Again, the problem was that they were thinking in abstract classes. Okay, let's get to Menger. Okay, how did Menger address the classical school? You find many modern Austrian economists, though not necessarily here, but there's another branch of Austrian economics that comes from Hayek. You'll find them belittling the classical school. Okay, their view is that Menger crushed the classical school, demolished the classical school. Okay, but that was not Menger's point at all. Okay, Menger recognized the achievement of classical economics. Okay, he liked the fact that they believed that that prices were determined by immutable laws. Okay, immutable natural laws. He was also very supportive in their belief that prices regulated production, that the allocation of resources was determined by prices. Okay. What he wanted to do, however, was to establish a causal link. Okay, this is where he saw the great lacuna or gap in classical economics. He wanted to establish a causal link between subjective value or use value the subjective value that underlies the choices of consumers, and the objective prices which business decision makers used in making their production decisions. Okay. So he wanted to establish that link. He believed that the classical economists did a good job at explaining how objective prices were used in entrepreneurs' decisions in deciding which industries to invest in and which industries to avoid. Okay? That they had explained reasonably well the effect of changes in supply when these decisions were made by the entrepreneurs on prices, and how these prices then reacted on on profits and losses, and as a result cause them to revise their own choices. So as I said before, Mises called the classical theory of economics a theory of calculated action. However, consumers don't calculate. Consumers don't react to profits and losses. Okay? In fact, it's consumer decisions and the values that underlie those decisions that drive the whole production process. The consumer then is the ultimate determinant of value, and not just value, but the value of all inputs, as well as the value of consumer goods, and the production decisions that are made on the basis of prices by entrepreneurs. Okay. Well, one of the things that Menger pointed out was that really a thing becomes a good only when it is recognized by an individual that it is capable of being used to satisfy one of his needs. Okay. Now, what Menger was very interested in was the law of cause and effect, okay, because of its influence on value and production, as I'll show you in a moment. For example, in notes that he wrote in preparing the principles of economics, he said, quote, "Man himself is the beginning and the end of every economy, and our science is a theory of a human being's ability to deal with his wants." So wants stood as a driving force of all economic activity. He also said all things are subject to the law of cause and effect. Now, how are these two things related? Wants and the law of cause and effect. The French economist Bastiat said that economics was about wants, efforts, and satisfactions. Menger modified this somewhat, this triad. He said, well, economics is about wants, goods, and satisfactions, and their relationships. Okay? A human want, let's say, a lack of water, okay, causes the production of a good that can satisfy that want. Okay? The good is a bottle of water. Once the good is produced and used by the human being, satisfaction results. Okay? So that was want-stimulated production. Causality ran from wants, which was a stimulus to produce the good, to satisfaction. But on the other hand, it ran the opposite way. Okay? Satisfaction was the reason why, the expectation of satisfaction, that the good was produced to begin with. Okay? So, value was attributed to the good because it satisfied a certain want. On the other hand, well, let's put it this way, the good caused the satisfaction, but yet the satisfaction caused the value of the good. Okay? So Menger saw cause and effect as a key point in economics. Now let me just say a few words about goods and how Menger conceived of goods before we get on to his value theory. What Menger said was that 4 things are necessary, 4 preconditions must be fulfilled before something can be called a good. Okay, I'll just read them to you. I won't put them on the board. First, there must be a human need. Okay. Second, he said, such properties as render the thing capable of being brought into causal connection with the satisfaction of this need. Okay. That is, the thing must possess certain qualities that will allow it to cause the satisfaction. Water has to have certain qualities which I recognize before it can satisfy my thirst. Okay? And which is the third thing, human knowledge of this causal connection. Okay? And finally, command of the thing sufficient to direct it to the satisfaction of the need. I must possess it. It must be my property. Okay? Whether legal or illegal, whether just or unjust, before it can satisfy a need. Now, Menger made one mistake in all of this. Okay? Remember, he said a human need must be present. The thing must be capable of bringing satisfaction to this need. Humans must know this connection, and they must possess the thing. But the second thing is unnecessary. Okay, I might think that, for whatever reason, if this is a bottle of arsenic, I might think that this satisfies my thirst better than water does. Okay? I would still pay, if I believe that, I would pay a price for it. Okay? People might think that this laying on of hands that nurses do now, I forget what the term is, where it can cure disease, okay, where they don't actually touch you, but they put their hands over you, okay. That may not be efficacious in curing disease. And yet if people believe that it is, and many people do, they pay for that service. So, even though Menger later on acted as if this were the case, acted as if he understood this, in his formal definition of a good, okay, he made a mistake. So really there's only three preconditions for a good: a human need or want, human knowledge or belief that there is a causal connection between the thing and the human want, and the possession of that thing. Okay. Later on, Menger said, well, there are things called, I can't remember if he used the word false wants, or no, false goods. And we would still pay a price for those. False goods are goods that really don't satisfy the need. But he's admitting there that his theory applies to all goods. So he was actually better than in his definition of, in using the notion of a good in his theory than he was at defining it. Okay, now let's talk about how, according to Menger, goods were valued. Okay, it was in his elaboration of the theory of marginal utility that he brilliantly resolved the paradox of value, which had stumped the classical school. In explaining the value of a good, Menger gave something like the following example. He said, let's assume that we have a certain good, and we'll use Robinson Crusoe or Tom Hanks on an island, okay, with only his own labor and the resources on the island available to him. Okay. So we're focusing on what's called a household economy, or an individual economy, or an autarkic economy. Okay. In any case, whatever you want to call it, Menger pointed out that for any good, people have concrete needs. Okay. We don't just say we need water. We need certain units of water. And we have different uses for those units. We need certain units of bread. We need certain types of automobiles. Okay. So let's assume that Robinson Crusoe on this island has various concrete needs for bushels of wheat. He finds that the soil is amenable to growing wheat, and so he therefore decides to grow the wheat. He has the equipment, the inputs, and so on to do that, and so he does. Now, after, let's assume, he harvests the wheat, he finds that the wheat can satisfy the following needs. Now, since these needs are all competing for the same good, they have to be ranked, okay, as more or less important to his life. Okay, so we'll rank them from first through sixth. Okay. Menger called this a scale of needs. Now in modern Austrian economics we call it a scale of value. Okay, needs has too much of a biological connotation, too much of an objectivistic connotation. Okay. Let's say that the first sack of wheat that Robinson Crusoe harvested would be used for his most important need or end for that wheat. And that would be, let's say, to produce bread just to keep him alive until the next harvest. So to produce enough bread to sustain his life. That's the want that motivates, or at least partially motivates, his production of the wheat. Okay. But to remain active and vital, he'll need a second sack of wheat to produce additional bread just to keep him healthy. Okay? With the first sack of wheat, just enough bread that's given by the first sack, all he could do is basically lay around on his island wouldn't have much energy to do anything else, just lay around and watch MTV or something. Okay, so now there's a third sack of wheat he could use for the next most important one, which is seed for the next harvest, to keep him alive for another year. Okay, so we have seed for harvest. Okay, he would use the wheat, plant it as seed, and then he would have another harvest. Fourth, he would want to vary his diet, so he would use it for feed for farm animals. Maybe find some renegade chickens on the island. He'll feed them so that they can provide him with eggs. Okay. Fifth, let's say he'll ferment it and make whiskey out of it. Okay. And sixth, he would use it for feed for pet monkeys and parrots, let's say. Okay. Keep him company while he's watching MTV. All right. Now, let's assume that he has 5 sacks of wheat. The harvest yields him 5 sacks of wheat. Okay. Obviously, he'll use the 5 for his 5 most important needs, the first 5. And now we can introduce some terminology. Okay. Utility in economics refers to satisfaction. The marginal utility of this supply of wheat is the least satisfaction that he can achieve from that supply. The lowest valued satisfaction, which is the whiskey. Okay. Now, Menger himself did not use the term marginal utility. He didn't use any term. It was his student, Ludwig von Mises, that coined the term marginal utility. But Menger raised the question in his principles. He said, what is the value of a sack of wheat? Do all 5 sacks of wheat have different values? But how could that be? They're identical. How could they have different values? Is the first sack more important than the 4th sack? And the 4th more important than the 5th sack? Well, what he did was to say, he answered it by another question. He said, if one sack was lost, let's say a marauding pack of foxes break in to his storage area where he's keeping the 5 sacks of wheat and consume the sack of wheat that's earmarked for the second quantity of bread he's going to produce. Okay? Menger said, does he leave this want unfulfilled? Of course not. Whether the fox consumes the 1st, the 3rd, the 2nd, the 4th, or the 5th, which want goes unfulfilled? The lowest valued want. Lowest valued want that could be served by that supply. So, what Menger said then is that the value of any good is equal to its marginal utility. Okay? That is, the satisfaction that is derived from the lowest valued use of that supply. Okay? But notice what happens to the value. If the fox indeed consumes one of these, what happens to the value of wheat now? It goes up, because a more important one is now dependent on having that sack of wheat. So now no matter which, with a supply of 4, wheat has a higher value than the one the supply is 5. And if he had only 1, it would have a higher value than if the supply was 2. So that's the law of marginal utility. As the supply of good increases, the marginal utility and therefore the value of the good decreases. Okay? There's no mathematical operation that can be performed with marginal utility here. It's just a relationship between a human mind and its scale of wants or values and the goods, the things that are found in the environment that are capable or that are believed to be capable of satisfying these wants. Okay? So what Menger insisted on was that there are concrete, by concrete he meant separate individual, concrete needs for things, okay, and concrete units of those things. And value is derived from the interaction of those two things. The supply of the thing and the value scale. Let me give you a modern example. I give my intro class. Let's say a family has 3 cars. Even though they might be different models physically, they're pretty interchangeable in that they can all serve the same purposes. The first car, let's say, goes to the primary breadwinner in the family, okay, to get to and from work. Okay, so it's the first car. The second automobile goes to, let's say, the person that takes care of the household tasks and so on. Might have a part-time job. And the third goes to Junior for social activities and so on. Let's say the old man cracks up his car. What happens, first of all, to the value of the cars? Well, first of all, what does this person go out well about the car? No. Okay, the car is immediately reallocated away from Junior to the primary breadwinner. Okay, but what happens to the value of the car, of automobiles to this family? It goes up. Okay. Let me give you another example very quickly, just to allow you to grasp this idea. Let's say an individual farmer has the following supplies of horses and cows, and now these animals are not interchangeable. They serve different purposes. The horses can be used for plowing, for pleasure riding, while the cows can be used for dairy products. Okay. So let's say we have first horse number 1, second horse number 2. Okay, and they would both be used for plowing. Okay. And third, we have cow number 1. And let's say that's used for milk. And fourth on his value scale. Okay. You can rank as many different goods, as we'll see in a few minutes, on your value scale as you're interested in. Okay. Or as you possess. Okay, fourth is cow number 2, and that would give him a supply of cheese for the year. And fifth, let's say, is horse number 3. So fifth, H3 for pleasure riding. Now, we're assuming the 3 horses are interchangeable, and the 2 cows are interchangeable, okay, with one another. But between the 2 groups of animals, 2 supplies, are not interchangeable. Okay, which animal is more valuable? Okay, which animal is more valuable to the farmer? Which animal, if the barn was burning down and he could only save 4, which animal would he leave in the barn? Okay. A horse. Because the marginal utility of the horse is lower than the marginal utility of the cow. That is, he prefers a year's supply of cheese to a year of pleasure riding. Okay, it's as simple as that. Now, once that horse is lost, what happens to the values of the 2 animals with relation to one another? Which animal is more valuable now? Now, horses are more valuable suddenly. Before, cows are more valuable. Why? Because the marginal utility of a horse is higher than the marginal utility of a cow. This is how Menger solved the paradox of value. He said, of course, water is higher up on people's scale of needs. The first units of water are much higher because it keeps you alive. Without water, you'll die within 3 days or whatever it is, 4 days. But in a normal situation, because of the scarcity of diamonds, the marginal utility of diamonds is higher than the marginal utility of water. If you lose a gallon of water in a normal situation, you lose the ability to satisfy a very, very low rank need. If you lose a diamond, okay, well, given their scarcity, the need that's dependent on the diamond, okay, sometimes may be called the dependent need, is much higher. However, let's switch that around. What if you were in a desert and you had a perfect 2-carat diamond in your pocket and you hadn't drank water in three days, and someone had a gallon of water? Well, that gallon's at the very top of your value scale. Okay, for most people who aren't suicidal, what would happen? Would you trade the diamond for the? Yes, of course you would, because the marginal utility of the diamond in that situation is lower than the marginal utility of water. Okay, so Menger brilliantly solved the problem of value, and in doing so, brought the consumer back into economics. Okay, and I'll show you how he did that. What Menger pointed out was that there was also what he called a causal nexus, or causal relationship, between goods. That is, that consumer goods don't just grow on trees. Okay? Consumer goods must be produced in most situations. Okay, most consumer goods do. So he pointed out that, in fact, all production processes take time and consist of the transformation of resources progressively into the final output, which is consumer goods. He called those goods which were furthest removed from satisfying consumers higher order goods, and those goods which were closest to consumers, that is consumer goods, lowest order goods. So what he did was the following. He said, production process gives rise to different orders of goods. Let me give you an example, the production of bread. Okay? He said, highest up, the sixth order, in the production of bread, that is furthest from consumers, would consist of some basic labor and natural resources. Let's say you would have to have labor and iron ore mine, and let's say some crude implements. Okay. What he said was that the combination of these goods cause the production of a capital good, a lower order good. Okay? So what you would get then from combining labor, the iron ore mine, and some implements is that you would get a supply of iron ore. Now, you combine iron ore, the capital good, with complementary goods. Okay? The term complementary applies in Austrian production theory to those goods which cooperate with the good in producing an output. So let's say you combine iron ore and labor, and that brings about the fourth order capital good, and let's say that capital good is the farm tools that you need. Okay. So the combination of this brought about the farm tool. Okay. A lower order capital good, a capital good that's even closer to consumer satisfaction. Now that farm tool is then combined with, let's say, more farm labor and farmland, and that produces wheat. Okay, so you get the idea. And now if we combine the wheat with miller's labor and a mill to grind the wheat, miller's labor, we then get the second order good, and let's just call that that's flour. And you combine the flour with the ovens and baker's labor, and transportation and so on, and you get bread at retail. The consumer stands down here. It is his or her wants that cause the value of bread. Okay? Using the law of marginal utility, people value bread because it serves concrete needs. Okay? All right, that's understood. But Menger said the reason why, so bread has value because it satisfies human wants. Not because of the production process. The production process doesn't yield the value to bread. Menger pointed out it's the opposite. Okay? The causation of value goes this way. Whereas production, the causal relationships in production go down towards the consumer. But the causal relationship of value goes up towards the higher order goods. The reason why people value flour, ovens, and baker's labor, okay, they can't eat ovens, they can't eat the flour without getting ill. This is only valuable because the production of bread at retail depends on these things, which in turn satisfy human wants. Okay? And because the third order goods produce the second order goods, they themselves are valuable. And again, the fourth order goods are only valuable insofar as they give rise to third order goods. So value travels up this way, production travels down this way. It's the law of cause and effect that Menger stressed so greatly. Okay. So Menger's law can be summed up in the following. The value of the means are determined by the value of the ends. This insight explodes the classical cost of production theory of value or labor theory of value. Okay? If for some reason in this society, I'll give you a more realistic example in a moment, for some reason in this society, no one liked bread. Let's say that it violated some religious observance. Okay? What would happen to the value, and what would happen to the value of ovens in this society? Assuming they can't cook anything else. What would happen to the value of farm tools? They become valueless. The example I give my students is the movie Witness, which Harrison Ford starred in, and he was an undercover cop in southeastern Pennsylvania in the Amish country. Anyway, so he lives among the Amish, and they point out in that movie that the Amish really forswear any sort of expression of vanity. They don't wear any jewelry. They don't even have buttons on their clothes. They just have hooks. Okay, so there's no ornamentation in their clothing. Anyway, to make a long story short, if all Americans adopted the values of Amish, what would happen to the value of diamonds? Assuming that, forgetting about their industrial uses for a moment. Fall to zero, right? Fall to zero. What would then happen to the value of the highly skilled jewelers? What would happen to their labor value? Fall to zero, at least as jewelers. And of course, diamond mines would be worthless. Okay? So it's not because diamonds are expensive to produce or costly to produce in terms of resources that diamonds are expensive. It's really the opposite. The reason why diamond mines command such a high price, the reason why skilled jewelers command such a high wage is precisely because diamonds have a high value. There was a French philosopher economist, Condillac, who wrote that oysters or pearls are not expensive because pearls are not expensive because men dive to great depths to get them, but men dive to great depths to get oysters and the pearls because they are so valuable. Okay? So it's the value of the good that determines the value of the inputs. Okay, but Menger actually went further than this. I mean, he was really a brilliant man. At this point, we've only explained that the value of the complementary goods depend on the value of the lower order goods that they cooperate in producing. Okay? But Menger went further and said, what is the value of one oven? What is the value of a plow? In other words, right now we know that if consumers spend $1,000 for bread, then the value of baker's labor, ovens, and flour in the second order, forgetting about interest for a moment, will be exactly $1,000. But how do we isolate particular value of these things? And here Menger used the law of marginal utility, but now applied to production. It seems as if this is an insoluble problem, right? Okay, how do we figure out the quota of value that we attach to any one of the many complementary goods that give rise to an output? And Menger had an answer to this. Let me give you the following example, which is not really the example Menger gave, but it makes his point. Let's say Robinson Crusoe, or no, let's say this is an exchange economy, so a farmer can produce 100 sacks of wheat. Okay, so he can produce 100 wheat. Okay, and this is production function. 100 sacks of wheat is a function of the following. Okay, make it very simple. 90 days of labor. Okay, he has to combine that with 2 horses, 1 plow, 10 acres of land, and 500 pounds of fertilizer. Okay? What's the value of 100 pounds of fertilizer. Okay? Assuming that wheat sells at, let's make this simple, wheat sells at $3 a bushel. Well, we know the value of the whole complex of inputs. It's 3 times 100, or $300. Okay? What Menger said is the following. When you produce something, most production processes are not like chemical processes. In order to produce water, you have to have 2 molecules of hydrogen and 1 molecule of oxygen. If you have any more of one or any more of the other, it's useless. It doesn't produce any more. And if you take one away, take 1 molecule of hydrogen away, you don't get water anymore. Okay? But he said most production processes are not like chemical reactions. He said in most production processes, you can vary the proportions in which the inputs are used. Okay? So what Menger said was the following. He said, all you would do is to take away, let's say, 100 pounds. Let's say fertilizer is sold in 100 weights. Okay, so 100 pounds. If you want to find out what the value or price of 100 weight is, you simply go to your production function, subtract a certain amount of that input, let's say 100 pounds, and find out what the effect is on the output. Right? Well, you can use less fertilizer. It's not going to cause the whole process to dissipate. You can still get wheat. You get less of it. Let's assume that now you get 95 bushels of wheat when you use 100 less pounds of fertilizer. Well, that is known as the marginal product. That's the marginal product of 100 pounds of fertilizer. The marginal product, okay, the 5 bushels of wheat that are subtracted from the production process times $3 gives you $15. Okay, that's the value of 100 weight of wheat in this production process. Now, Menger did not take his analysis into the area of the monetary economy. Okay, what Menger did was to look on this process as being carried out by, let's say, Robinson Crusoe. So then all you would say is that the value of 100 pounds of fertilizer is whatever the marginal utility of 5 bushels of wheat is. Okay. Menger, this book was only meant as an introduction to a multi-volume setting out all economics. So he stopped short of talking about the pricing of the factors of production. That was done by his student Eugen von boehm-bawerk. Okay. But Menger had he had the modern theory of how prices are determined on factor markets basically in embryo, okay, in an undeveloped form, okay, and it just took boehm-bawerk to develop it further. And then later, a great American economist, J.B. Clark, who was a Mengerian, gave it really its definitive elaboration. Okay, one last point I'll make about Menger. Okay, Menger was also interested in exchange, in explaining exchange, and how exchange was driven by consumer choices based on marginal utility. And at the beginning of his section on exchange, he disagrees vigorously with Adam Smith, who explained exchange as sort of an innate propensity of human beings. Adam Smith said that human beings had a propensity to truck and barter. Okay, it was almost like exchange was a game. Okay, but Menger said, no, that's not true. Okay, the reason why people exchange was because they value different goods differently between themselves on their value scales. So Menger asked the question, if there were 2 individuals, one who had a supply of, let's say, 5 horses, so individual 1 has 5 horses, the other individual has, let's say, 5 cows. Okay. How many horses and cows would be exchanged? Now, this was prior to explaining how prices were determined, so Menger just assumed that the exchange ratio would be 1 horse for 1 cow. Okay. Doesn't mean that as we'll see, that doesn't imply equality in the value of a horse and a cow. So let's say you had individual A, individual B. Okay? Individual A would be willing to trade horses for cows as long as the marginal utility of the horse, what he was giving up, was lower than the marginal utility of the cows that he was getting. Okay? So let's say a trade took place of 3 horses. That would mean that A valued horses and cows in the following way. Okay? Actually, let me explain something prior to that. As A trades horses for cows, 2 things happen. Okay? His horses diminish in supply, they reduce in supply. What happens to the value of the horses, the remaining horses? They get higher and higher because remaining horses serve to satisfy higher valued needs. At the same time, as he gets additional cows in exchange, what happens to the value of cows? They fall. So what Menger pointed out was, at some point, A will stop exchanging horses for cows. And what's that point? When the additional cow, let's say the 4th cow, say he's already exchanged 3 horses for 3 cows. Okay? If the 4th cow that he could get, okay, so 4th cow, had a lower value than the 4th horse that he had to give up, he'd stop at that point. Okay? Let's take a simple example. If you go to go to a supermarket and buy 2 6-packs of Coke, we can ask the question, why didn't you buy 3 6-packs of Coke? Okay? Well, let's say it's $6 a 6-pack, okay, or $5 a 6-pack. Okay, you're the buyer of Coke. Okay, you value the Coke more than the $5. Okay, on the other hand, the seller values the $5 that he's getting in exchange more than the Coke. So what Menger pointed out is that exchange implies a reverse valuation of the goods exchanged, meaning that the buyer and the seller value the goods in reverse order. Okay, the seller always values the money in a monetary economy more than the good he's giving up. The buyer always values the good more than the money that she's giving up. Okay. Now, the buyer may buy 2 6-packs and stop. Why? Because the 3rd 6-pack would have what? A lower value than the $5 because of the law of marginal utility. We don't know where it's going to stop, but at some point you stop buying a certain type of good because its value has fallen so low that now your money is better spent on other goods, or maybe better spent or better used as an investment. Okay? So when you go into a supermarket, if you fill your basket, you're going to have a certain number of units of each good. Okay? When you walk out of there, okay, you will be satisfied at that point in time with what you got, because buying any additional unit of any more steak, any more potatoes, any more potato chips, any more soda would mean that you'd be giving up money that had a higher value to you for goods that had a lower value. That's what explains why people stop exchanging at a certain point. Okay, and that's what Menger did. Now, what's the implication? The implication is that exchange does not, as the classical economists thought, imply equality of value between the goods exchanged. Whatever you purchase, okay, when you make that purchase, the implication is that you value that good more than the purchase price. Okay. And I'll stop there. And I'll take 5 minutes of questions. Okay. Any questions? Comments? Yes. Bill.
Adam Smith say something similar to that in terms of exchange and opposed exchange of equal value. I think Smith said something to the fact that one value, if you engage in exchange, one value society more than that. Unfortunately, apparently didn't see through the implications of it from marginal utility.
Menger may have been a little hard on Smith. I went back and looked at it. I can't remember exactly what Smith said. I mean, he doesn't really have that. But
I know that Say made that error. And I think some of the English classes were less likely to make that particular error. But the problem was that once they went to this cost of production, now Say didn't follow that line, but the English classes did. Once they went to that, it was very difficult to be able to naturally develop any theory of exchange out of that, other than the fact that it's something that happened.
Well, I would just say they weren't focused. I mean, look, they already had the notion that two objects that were exchanged were going to be equal in value, okay, because of their theory of value, the labor theory of value or the cost of production theory of value. But I had mentioned Menger's comment on Adam Smith in an Austrian colloquium at NYU, and Roger Koppel said, go back and read it because Menger was a little bit too hard on Smith. And I did, but I can't remember what Smith exactly. I mean, he said what I said he said, but he went on and somehow qualified it. Yes?
So the reason Menger criticized the application of Menger's approach to determine the value of inputs.
Yes, Wieser didn't agree with Menger and boehm-bawerk on this.
Yes, and how would you agree with the fact that removing the 500 pounds of
the 100 pounds of fertilizer.
In a case where fertilizer is needed in the production process, and without the 500 pounds,
yes,
there couldn't be any
production process. Yes.
But how would you agree with that? That it could be,
well,
if you come to 95 sacks of wheat,
yeah,
when removing the 500 pounds of fertilizer won't bring any wheat at all.
Oh, if you moved all 500 pounds?
Yes.
Well, again, you're talking about marginal units. But let's assume that you needed a fixed amount to get any. Let's say, example of, if I want to dye a shirt, I need a certain amount of labor, I need the shirt, and I just need a certain amount of purple dye. A certain amount of purple dye, no more and no less. If I don't have that, there is no shirt. Okay? Well, that becomes more complicated. Menger didn't deny that could exist, those examples could exist. He said there were certain production processes that were like chemical reactions. But Mises went on and explained that as long as that purple dye isn't specific to that production process, as long as it's used in other production processes, there will be a price of that purple dye. You can get, in other words, because other entrepreneurs are bidding for that factor, a price will be established on the market, even though in one particular production process you can't figure out its value. Okay?
Yes, but then this approach is only applicable in cases where you can get rid of one.
Yeah. But that's most of the cases in the real world. Most of the cases, you can vary the proportions of the goods you use without losing all of the product. Right?
Yes,
okay.
You mean vary, but not eliminating it completely.
Well, it doesn't matter. I mean, but again, you can, obviously if we eliminate all steel from producing cars, then you can't have a car. Okay? But so what? Because we use steel in increments, in units. We can use more or less steel, okay? And again, steel is used in many production processes. So if many other ones were, you could vary steel, and one that you couldn't, you'd still get a price for steel. Look in Human Action. If you're really interested in following this up, Mises has talks about this in Human Action, okay? When he talks about there's a section on pricing the factors of production. Any other questions? One more? Yes.
Were there consequences on the understanding Marxism of this theory, or how they follow the classical theory and they develop the emphasis on capital accumulation?
You're saying, well, the Marxists did follow the classical theorists, okay, and the marginal utility theorists, especially Austrian marginal utility theorists, boehm-bawerk and Wicksteed, I think, had devastating criticisms of Marx on the basis of Austrian marginal utility theory. Okay, but we could talk about this another time. Because I'm not sure I'm following.
No, that was the main difference between the Marxists and the.
Analytically, is a theory of value, right? That's the main difference. Yes, it's a theory of value.